Several years ago, I was listening to the radio and someone shared a quote from Booker T. Washington, the famous founder of the Tuskegee Institute. And they mentioned that the quote came from his autobiography. The quote was so interesting that I looked up his autobiography, I got the book, and I read it. And I was all in. In reading his stories of growing up as a slave on a plantation in the southern United States, his stories of being given a new outfit made out of coarse woven flax that itched until it was finally worn in. He described his vision for a school where black men would receive not only a classical education, but where they would also train for a marketable skill. He landed on brickmaking, proclaiming that the graduates of the Tuskegee Institute would be known as the best brickmakers in the southern United States. I distinctly remember his description of his first vacation when, after several years of leadership at the school, he was finally able to take a vacation to tour Europe. He described how he realized that we Americans are always in a hurry. The book was fascinating. I told all my friends about what I was reading. That was probably 10 years ago, but I can still remember these scenes and these stories that I just told you. After reading the book, I so wish that I could meet Booker T. Washington, because just by reading his autobiography, I felt like I got to know him just a little bit. I knew his story, his values, and his dreams. I didn't even need to see a picture of him. My mind has drawn a picture of this great leader. I've discovered that I really like to read biographies because I really enjoy getting to know influential people from the past. In fact, even as I'm recording this series, we're getting ready to start a new year in just a few weeks. And as I'm making some goals for the next year, one of my own goals is to read a number of biographies of spiritual giants. Not to copy them, but just because I find great inspiration in reading about the lives of others. They inspire me, and I almost feel like I make new friends. Contrast that with an experience I had a few years ago with a small group that I was leading. We would gather weekly to discuss the Bible and our spiritual lives, and then support and encourage each other and pray for each other. Well, one week, we simply talked about who God is. So I started with what I thought was a pretty simple question. Tell me about God and what you know about God. Well, I imagined that the group would come up with a list of words and phrases to describe God, but it was mostly awkward silence. God is love, someone said, and that was about all the group could come up with. Now, don't get me wrong, the Bible itself says that God is love and that Jesus showed that love by how he lived. But that's not all that God is. God is not a shallow, one-dimensional character. He's a complex person. We've already talked about how God has a mind and emotions and a will. He makes things happen according to who he is. So here's what I want you to think about today. The Bible is God's autobiography. God, who is invisible, does not want to be a stranger. He does not want to be unknown to us. He also does not want us to figure out who he is all on our own, because on our own, we'll go astray and we will invent misrepresentations of him. God wants to be known, and he wants us to know him. And so, he has revealed himself to us. God reveals himself to us in creation. In the letter to the Christ followers living in the city of Rome, the Apostle Paul wrote this: "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature. I hear so many people say that they feel closest to God when they're out in nature. And that makes sense because you're hanging out inside the artistic masterpiece of the universe's greatest artist. Through the creation, we get to know the Creator. God especially reveals Himself to us through Jesus. In another letter, Paul writes that Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Now that seems like a contradiction until we realize that Jesus is God and literally shows us who God is. Using only nature, we might come to some incorrect conclusions about who God is. But Jesus makes God crystal clear. And how do we know anything about Jesus? Our Bible. And even in the prequel that we call the Old Testament, we see God. God reveals Himself to us in His inspired book, the Bible. Even though Jesus is no longer walking on earth, teaching and healing, we have preserved for us His life and His words. And by reading them, we get to know God. Just like when I read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, and through it, I got to know him and his values and his dreams. When I read my Bible, I get to know God and God's values and God's dreams. Here is why this matters so much. Sometimes we treat the Bible as if it is an instruction book for life, similar to the owner's manual for your car. But nobody reads their owner's manual so that they can become friends with their car. We only read the owner's manual when we can't figure out how to make the car do what we want it to do. And if you approach the Bible as simply an owner's manual for life, then you will only pick it up when you need to solve a problem in your life. But the Bible cannot possibly have a direct answer for every problem you will ever face in your lifetime. This assumption has caused some people to dismiss the Bible as out of touch and out of date. The Bible is also primarily not a book of morals and ethics. Yes, there are large sections where God tells us how to live, what to do, and what not to do. But the same Bible also describes how we humans are actually incapable of living up to the ethical ideals outlined in the Bible. And what's the solution? Jesus, the Son of God. People get really confused when they approach the Bible as if it is some kind of a history textbook or a science textbook or a grammar textbook. These assumptions will lead you astray, and they will leave you bored at best and cynical at worst. Your Bible is essentially God's autobiography. And He inspired a wide variety of writers to write down their experiences with Him. Do you realize the incredible diversity of the Bible? It was written down by over 40 authors who lived over the course of 2,000 plus years on 3 different continents. These authors were kings, farmers, fishermen, professional scribes, and musicians. And yet, with all of this diversity, there is a consistent picture of God who inspired all of these authors to write what they did so that all of humanity, living anywhere at any point in human history, could get to know Him and love Him and serve Him. God inspired the Bible to be written down so that you would read it, and by reading it, that you would know Him, that you would love Him, and that you would serve Him. Because when you really know God, love Him, and serve Him, then you can be at peace with yourself and with others, and then we can make the world a better place. As we near the end of this course, with only 2 lessons after today, you'll be left with a choice. Will you continue this new habit? Or, like most other programs that promise life change in only 15 minutes a day, will it fall by the wayside? You see, as we read our Bibles, we not only get to know God, but we also hear the story that He is trying to tell. And quite often, the stories that God tells are different from the stories that we tell ourselves. Sometimes we tell ourselves that no one can forgive the things we've done. But God tells us a story in which no sin is too big to receive forgiveness that was provided by the death of Jesus. Sometimes we tell ourselves that we're pretty good people and surely God would accept us. But God tells us a story in which we are all sons and daughters who have run away from home to do our own thing. But that in His story, He is a loving Father who pursues us and finds us and brings us back home. When we read our Bibles, we read lots of stories that all tell the same big story of God. And I regularly need God to tell me His story to correct the other stories that I am tempted to believe. So I have another biography. I put it on my Amazon wish list, and my sister bought it for me for Christmas last year. It's the best biography there is of Winston Churchill, the most influential leader of Great Britain in the 1900s. It is well researched and well written, but it's over 1,000 pages, and so it's very detailed. I'm at about the 200-page mark, and Winston has not even yet been elected Prime Minister for the first time. Now, I'm learning a lot, but I'm not sure I really want to know 1,000 pages worth of Churchill's life. And I've read enough to know that I don't even like him. So now I'm trying to decide if I should just quit and call it good. Or maybe just settle for a 100-page summary version. But I'm a finish what I start kind of a person, so I'm conflicted. Luckily, Booker T. Washington's autobiography was only 136 pages. So here's today's takeaway. When I read my Bible, I am spending time with God. And since the Bible is God's autobiography, when I read my Bible, I'm actually getting to know God better. That mindset will encourage me to keep reading, even the parts I've read before, because I want to know God better and better. But I also have to decide, do I really want to know God better, or do I just claim to want to know Him better? And my prayer for you is that you want to know God so well that you will make it a lifetime habit to engage God through His Word. Well, for today's Hydrate Challenge, you're going to read chapter 2 of 2 Peter for the second time. Yesterday, you read it by engaging your mind, hopefully to engage also with the mind of God. Today, you're going to engage your heart, to engage the heart of God. Pay attention to how you feel as you read. Write down the emotions that you experience as you read. Then sit in those emotions and see if you sense that Jesus is trying to say something to you. Maybe it's just a word or a phrase. Write it down in your workbook. Talk to God about it. Go. Hydrate.